South Texas, 1847. A man named Roque sits motionless on his horse in the pre-dawn darkness, studying tracks in the dirt that most men wouldn't even see. The hoofprints are 3 days old, blown over with dust, barely visible even in good light. But Roque can read them like a book. How many horses, which direction, how fast they were moving, whether they were running or grazing. He's been tracking this herd for 2 weeks. 50 wild mustangs led by a stallion. They've never been touched by human hands. Their ancestors ran wild for generations, descended from Spanish horses that escaped the conquistadors 2 centuries ago. And Roque is going to catch them. This is the story of the Mustangers, men who spent months alone in brutal country, tracking wild horse herds across hundreds of miles, building hidden corrals in remote canyons, then driving panicked animals into traps. It required reading signs invisible to most people, understanding horse psychology better than the horses understood themselves, and surviving in places where water was scarce and predators were everywhere. Between the 1700s and early 1900s, millions of wild horses roamed the American West. Historian J. Frank Dobie estimated the peak population at around 2 million by the late 1800s, though he admitted this was an educated guess since no scientific census existed. They ran in vast herds across Texas, New Mexico, California, Nevada, and the Great Plains, so many horses that early travelers described them as waves in the ocean, herds that took hours to pass by. One man in 1847 wrote, "I have seen thousands and tens of thousands of wild horses running in immense herds all over the western country, as far as the eye or telescope could sweep the horizon. The whole country seemed to be running." These weren't domestic horses gone feral. These were animals that had lived wild for generations. They'd never known rope or saddle or human voice. They were faster, tougher, and more suspicious than any ranch horse. Their senses were knife-sharp. They could smell a man from a mile away, hear a footstep that wouldn't wake a sleeping dog, and they were valuable. The U.S. Army needed horses, freight companies needed horses, ranches needed horses, mining operations needed horses. There was constant demand, and the Mustangs were free for anyone who could catch them. That's where the Mustangers came in. Many were Mexican vaqueros, the original cowboys who'd been working cattle and horses in what's now Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California since the 1600s. They'd learned techniques passed down through generations, inherited from Spanish horsemen who'd learned from Moorish horsemen centuries before that. These men knew horses in a way most Americans didn't. They'd grown up around them, been strapped to their mothers' backs as infants, learning to ride before they could walk. They understood how horses thought, how they communicated, how a herd moved as one organism, and they knew how to hunt. The first step was finding a herd. That meant riding for days or weeks through empty country, reading the land, looking for signs, hoofprints, manure, trails worn through brush where horses passed regularly, waterholes where herds drank. A skilled tracker could look at a hoofprint and tell you how long ago the horse passed, whether it was walking or running, whether it was healthy or lame, whether it was a stallion or mare. Roque and his brother Romano were famous for this. One account says they could strike a trail and follow it by deceptive moonlight and starlight, tracking in near darkness when most men couldn't see their own hands. They'd study the tracks, then predict where the herd would go next. Horses are creatures of habit. They follow the same trails between grazing areas and water. They have favorite spots to rest. A Mustanger who understood this could get ahead of a herd instead of chasing behind it. Once you located a herd, the real work began. You couldn't just ride up and rope them. Wild Mustangs would bolt at the first human scent, running for miles without stopping. You had to think like them, move like them, become part of their world without them knowing you were there. Some Mustangers would spend weeks just observing a herd, learning their patterns, where they grazed at dawn, where they watered at midday, where they bedded down at night, which trails they used, how the stallion positioned himself relative to the mares, how the herd reacted to threats. All of this intelligence would be used later. The most common capture method was the corral trap. Find a narrow canyon or draw where horses naturally funneled through. Build wings extending out from a hidden corral, long lines of brush, logs, or even ribbons of cheesecloth tied to poles. The wings would be miles long in some cases, gradually narrowing toward the corral entrance. The corral itself was built from whatever was available. In the mesquite country of South Texas, Mustangers cut posts and set them 2.5 feet into the ground, rising 6 to 8 feet above, each post standing as close as possible to the next. They'd lash long poles horizontally with rawhide all around the pen, about 2/3 of the height above ground. In timbered country farther north, lodgepole pine logs stacked and lashed together. In desert country, rocks piled into walls. The corral had to be strong enough to hold panicked horses trying to kick their way out. One weak spot and the whole trap was useless. Building these corrals took days or weeks. You worked alone or with 1 or 2 partners. You hauled logs or rocks through country with no roads. You built in places so remote that if you got injured, you'd likely die before anyone found you. And you had to build in secret. The horses couldn't know the corral was there. That meant working quietly, approaching only when the horses were far away, covering your tracks, removing human scent from the area. One technique involved camouflaging the corral entrance. You'd leave the gate open, but create the illusion of a continuing trail. Then you'd position bait inside, water in dry country, or good grazing, or salt licks. The horses would wander in following their normal route, not realizing they'd entered a trap until the gate swung shut behind them. But the most dramatic method was the drive. This required multiple riders and precise timing. The Mustangers would position themselves miles away from the corral, staying downwind and out of sight. Then, at a signal, they'd show themselves to the herd. The horses would bolt instantly. That was expected. The trick wasn't to catch them. It was to guide their panic in the right direction. The riders would stay behind and to the sides of the running herd, pushing them toward the corral wings without getting close enough to scatter them. If you pushed too hard, the horses would split and scatter in all directions. If you didn't push hard enough, they'd slow down and realize they were being herded. Wild stallions are smart. The stallion would try to lead his mares in circles, attempting to exhaust the riders and escape. The Mustangers had to anticipate this. They'd scout the terrain beforehand, knowing which trails the horses would take, then position riders to cut off escape routes. This is where understanding horse psychology mattered most. Horses are herd animals. They follow the leader. If you could control where the lead mare went, the rest would follow. Experienced Mustangers would target the lead mare, not the stallion. Get her running toward the corral and the stallion would follow rather than abandon his herd. The chase could last for days. You'd run the horses during daylight, then back off at night, picking up the trail again at dawn. The first night, the horses would run for miles. The second night, they'd barely travel at all, too exhausted. By the third day, they'd be walking, too tired to run anymore. That's when you push them into the corral. One account describes the technique. The riders would keep up this pattern for about 3 days, running the horses when there was daylight. The first night, the horses would usually travel quite far, but they'd hardly travel any distance on the second night. After a while, they'd get used to the riders. By the evening of the third day, they'd get tired and walk. At this point, they could work them more easily towards a trap. When the exhausted horses finally funneled into the corral wings, they'd follow the narrowing path without realizing it was a trap. The wings would close in gradually, first 100 yards apart, then 50, then 20. By the time the horses saw the corral ahead, momentum and the press of animals behind would carry them through the gate. The Mustangers would slam the gate shut. Then the horses would explode. 50 half-ton animals in blind panic, crashing into walls, screaming, trying to kick through logs or leap over barriers. The sound was unlike anything else. Hooves thundering against wood, the high-pitched neighing of terrified animals, the crack of logs being tested to their breaking point. The corral had to hold. If it didn't, the horses would scatter and you'd wasted weeks of work. You'd leave them alone for hours, letting them exhaust themselves. Eventually, they'd calm down enough to realize they weren't being attacked. They'd stand trembling, covered in sweat, sides heaving. That's when the breaking process would begin. But that's another story entirely. The physical toll on the Mustangers was brutal. These men would spend months in the field with almost nothing. A bedroll, basic food, dried meat, beans, maybe some flour for flatbread, a canteen, a knife, a rope. That was it. They slept on the ground under makeshift shelters, a few tree branches, maybe a strip of old blanket overhead, and to the north to block the wind. In Texas in summer, temperatures hit over 100 degrees. In winter, northern winds would freeze anything exposed. They ate whatever they could kill. The country was full of game in those years: wild cattle, deer, antelope, wild hogs, turkeys, ducks. A man with a rifle didn't starve, but he also didn't eat well. Same meat every day, no vegetables, no variety. One Mustanger in 1857 killed between 600 and 700 deer in 6 months along a 20-mile stretch between Corpus Christi and Laredo. That gives you some idea of how abundant game was. You could eat fresh meat every single day if you had ammunition and the energy to hunt. Water was the constant problem. Much of Mustang country was desert or semi-arid grassland. You tracked horses to water, but water holes might be 20 miles apart. You rationed what you carried. You learned which water was safe to drink and which would make you sick. The sun destroyed you. Mustangs developed permanent squints from riding into glare for months. Their skin turned to leather, cracked, burned, aged beyond their years. Many went partially blind later in life from sun damage. The isolation was complete. You might work with 1 or 2 partners, but conversation was minimal. You spoke in hand signals when near the horses. You whispered if you had to talk. Otherwise, you were silent, alone with your thoughts and your work. Some Mustangers loved it. They'd work season after season, year after year, vanishing into the desert for months and returning with herds of 20 or 50 or 100 horses. They'd sell them for whatever the market would bear. Sometimes decent money, sometimes barely enough to cover supplies for the next hunt. The Mexican vaquero named Roque became legendary for his skill. One account describes him demonstrating his archery. At my request, to show me what he could do with his Indian bow, shot through and through one side of a flour barrel and nearly through the other side. He could shoot with wonderful precision and rapidly, seemingly taking no aim, but nevertheless striking the mark with great accuracy. But it was his tracking that people remembered most. The acuteness and skill of these men in striking a trail or in following a trail was marvelous. It appeared to be almost an animal instinct. That phrase, almost an animal instinct, captures something essential about the Mustangers. They existed in a liminal space between human civilization and wild nature. They understood animals in ways that seemed supernatural to people who lived in towns. They could read landscapes that looked empty to everyone else, but there was nothing supernatural about it. It was learned skill, accumulated over lifetimes and passed down through generations. It was thousands of hours spent watching horses, studying their behavior, learning to think like them. It was the ability to read tiny signs, a bent blade of grass, a displaced rock, a faint scent on the wind, and construct from those fragments a complete picture of where a herd had been and where it was going. Other Mustangers became famous too. Bob Lemons, an African-American Mustanger who worked the Carrizo Springs area of Texas, developed a technique so unusual that J. Frank Dobie called him the most original Mustanger. Lemons would work alone, living with a wild herd for days or weeks until they accepted his presence. He'd move with them, graze near them, water with them. Eventually, he'd mount the lead stallion and literally take control of the herd, leading them into a pen. "I grew up with the Mustangs," Lemon said. "I acted like I was a Mustang, made them think I was one of them." Philip Nolan, an early Mustanger, made expeditions from Louisiana into Texas, starting in the 1790s. He had returned driving herds of hundreds or even thousands of horses. On one expedition in 1797, he returned with a herd estimated between 1,000 and 2,500 horses. But in 1801, during an illegal expedition into Spanish Texas, he was killed by Spanish troops at his camp north of Nacogdoches on March 21st. His men were captured and spent years in Spanish prisons. By the 1860s, mustanging had become a profitable business. Cowboys and vaqueros would capture horses for their own use or to sell. The U.S. Army paid well for mustangs during the Civil War and later during the Indian Wars. The horses were tough, could survive on poor forage, and had incredible endurance. During World War I, hundreds of thousands of mustangs were rounded up and shipped to Europe. The British and French were desperate for horses. Mustangers made fortunes capturing wild herds and driving them to railheads for shipment overseas. But the work was changing. By the early 1900s, mechanization was arriving. Trucks and eventually airplanes made it easier to spot and chase horses. What had required weeks of skilled tracking could now be done in days with motorized vehicles. The old methods faded. The patient, months-long hunts, the reading of tracks by moonlight, the hand-built corrals in remote canyons, the understanding between hunter and prey that bordered on spiritual. By the 1920s, very few Mustangers worked in the traditional way. The wild horse population had declined dramatically. Overgrazing, hunting, and the expansion of fenced ranches had eliminated much of the Mustang's range. Where millions had once roamed, only scattered bands remained. By 1926, the population had been cut in half. By 1971, when Congress finally passed the Wild Free-Roaming Horses and Burros Act, only about 17,000 wild horses remained in the entire American West. Today, roughly 80,000 wild horses still roam public lands in the American West. They're protected by federal law and managed by the Bureau of Land Management. When populations exceed what the land can support, horses are rounded up using helicopters, a method that's controversial, stressful for the animals, and nothing like the patient hunts of the old Mustangers. A few people still practice traditional mustanging on a small scale. The Navajo in Arizona and New Mexico maintain a tradition of capturing a few wild horses each year, training them using methods passed down through generations. These horses are valued because they're tough, adapted to desert conditions, and don't need the constant care that domestic horses require. But the era of men like Roque, tracking herds across empty deserts for months, reading 3-day-old tracks by starlight, building hidden corrals in nameless canyons, and driving 50 wild horses through a landscape that would kill most men. That era is gone. What remains is the evidence they left. Stone corrals still stand in remote corners of Texas and New Mexico, faint trails worn into rock by the passage of countless hooves. Stories passed down through families about grandfathers who spent their youth chasing wild horses. And the horses themselves. Every Mustang alive today is descended from ancestors that survived the Mustangers. They're the ones that were too fast, too smart, or too lucky to be caught. The natural selection imposed by Mustangers made them tougher, warier, more adaptable. In a way, the Mustangers created the modern Mustang. Not just through the horses they caught and bred, but through the ones that escaped. The Mustangers' hunt was never about domination. It was about matching your skill against an animal that had every advantage: speed, endurance, knowledge of the terrain, and the absolute determination to stay free. Sometimes you won, sometimes the horses did, and both of you were shaped by the contest. Men like Roque would spend weeks tracking herds through the South Texas brush country. They'd build corrals in hidden canyons near water sources. They'd run the horses for 3 days until exhaustion made them manageable. They'd trap dozens at a time. But some horses always escaped. Stallions that split from the herd at the last moment, mares that found gaps in the corral wings, young horses fast enough to outrun the pursuit. These were the survivors. the ones that passed their wariness and speed to the next generation, the ones that learned from each encounter with humans and taught their offspring to be cautious. The Mustangers knew this. They knew they were part of a selection process as old as predator and prey. They weren't trying to eliminate the wild horses. They were engaging in a contest where both sides evolved, adapted, and survived. And maybe that was how it should be.